Amelia stood at the kitchen counter, absently stirring her cup of tea as the early morning sun streamed through the windows of their suburban home. The soft golden light bathed the room, making it feel like a scene from one of the paintings she adored. Calm, balanced, perfect. Yet perfection had grown stale. Her husband, Jonathan, sat at the dining table, his head buried in the morning newspaper. He was a man of habit, up by 6:30, coffee with 2 sugars at 6:45, and breakfast by 7. For today was no exception. He glanced at her with a warm smile, his brown eyes crinkling at the edges. "You look lost in thought," he remarked, folding the paper neatly. Amelia forced a smile. "Just thinking about the meeting I have later," he nodded, satisfied with her response. "You'll do great as always." Jonathan's unwavering support had been the foundation of their marriage for the past 6 years. He was the kind of man women dreamed of marrying, kind, reliable, and endlessly patient. He had built her the life she'd once longed for. A beautiful home, stability, and a love she could count on. But as Amelia gazed out the window at the perfectly manicured lawn, she couldn't ignore the growing void inside her. It wasn't Jonathan's fault. He hadn't done anything wrong. The problem was her, though she couldn't quite articulate what it was. Later that morning she kissed him goodbye as he left for work. His hand lingered on her cheek, and his gaze held the familiar warmth that had once made her heart race. Now, it only made her chest tighten with guilt. That evening, Jonathan insisted they attend a charity gala hosted by his law firm. Amelia reluctantly agreed, slipping into a black satin dress that hugged her figure in all the right places. Jonathan beamed when he saw her, his pride evident as he took her hand. "You're stunning," he said softly. They arrived at the event to a sea of glimmering gowns and sharp suits. Jonathan immediately began mingling, introducing Amelia to colleagues and clients. She played her role well, smiling, laughing at jokes, and nodding politely. But her mind wandered. As the evening wore on, Amelia excused herself to the dessert table, needing a moment of solitude. She absently reached for a macaron when a deep, smooth voice caught her off guard. "Careful, those are addictive." Startled, she turned to see a man standing beside her. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his tailored navy suit emphasizing his strong frame. Dark curls framed his face, and his piercing green eyes seemed to hold a secret. "You'll take my chances," she replied, her lips curving into a small smile. "Lucas," he introduced himself. Extending a hand. "Amelia," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his touch warm. They exchanged pleasantries, and soon the conversation deepened. Lucas spoke with a confidence that was magnetic, his words laced with wit and a charm. Amelia found herself laughing more freely than she had in months. "Your husband's a lucky man," he remarked, glancing across the room at Jonathan. Amelia's smile faltered for a moment. "Yes," she said, her tone quieter. Lucas noticed the shift but didn't press. Instead, he handed her a champagne flute and raised his own, to addictive desserts and unexpected conversations. He toasted. She clinked her glass against his, the warmth of his gaze, lingering long after. They parted ways that evening. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of Lucas lingered. Amelia told herself it was just a harmless encounter, a moment of levity in an otherwise predictable life. Yet, when she found herself at a cafe one afternoon, it was as though fate had other plans. Lucas was there, seated by the window with a book in hand. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up in recognition. "Amelia," he greeted her, his smile genuine. "Lucas, she replied, her voice tinged with surprise. "What are the odds? Smaller city than we think," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. She hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The conversation flowed as effortlessly as it had at the gala. Lucas spoke of his passion for architecture, the way he believed spaces could shape emotions. Amelia found herself sharing parts of her life she hadn't spoken about in years. Her dreams of traveling, her love of art, the parts of her marriage she carefully skirted around. By the time they finished their coffee, the sun had dipped low in the sky, and Amelia felt a strange mixture of guilt and exhilaration. Their meetings became more frequent. Accidental run-ins at the cafe turned into planned coffee dates, then long walks in the park. Amelia told herself it was innocent, that she and Lucas were just friends. But deep down, she knew she was treading dangerous waters. Lo! Amelia's breath hitched. "Lucas, Before she could finish, he leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both gentle and urgent. For a moment she froze, torn between the life she had and the temptation that Lucas represented. Then she kissed him back. The rain beat against the windows, muffling the sound of her world breaking apart. Amelia returned home that evening to find Jonathan cooking dinner, his usual warm smile greeting her at the door. Long day, he asked, kissing her cheek. "Yeah," she replied, her voice shaky. As they sat down to eat, Amelia couldn't meet his eyes. Every word he spoke, every act of kindness, felt like a dagger to her chest. Yet, she couldn't stop thinking about Lucas, the way he made her feel alive, seen and desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. The days after the kiss with Lucas blurred together. Amelia lived two lives now, each pulling her in opposite directions. At home, she played the role of the devoted wife, cooking dinners, sharing quiet evenings with Jonathan, and nodding along to his stories about work. But in the hidden corners of her heart, a storm raged. Her phone became a lifeline to Lucas. She waited for his texts with a breathless anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. "Thinking of you. When can I see you again?" His messages were simple, but charged with meaning. One evening, while Jonathan was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it instinctively, her heart leaping at Lucas' name on the screen. Tomorrow. Same place, same time. Amelia hesitated. Jonathan's laughter echoed faintly from the bathroom. He was singing along to one of his favorite songs, completely unaware of the betrayal brewing in their home. "Nice," she typed back, her fingers trembling. The next afternoon, Amelia found herself sitting across from Lucas at a small cafe tucked away from prying eyes. The air between them was electric, every glance and touch charged with unspoken desire. "Tell me about him," Lucas said suddenly, his tone quiet but firm. Amelia stiffened. "Jonathan," he nodded. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "What is there? Why are you still with him?" Amelia looked down at her hands, her wedding ring glinting in the sunlight. "Jonathan is safe. He's good. I've never doubted his love for me." "And yet," Lucas murmured, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You're here with me." The truth hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Amelia felt the weight of what she was doing. But when Lucas's thumb brushed her knuckles, the guilt melted away, replaced by the intoxicating pull of his presence. The first time they made love, it was in a boutique hotel on the edge of the city. Lucas had booked the room under an assumed name, his attention to discretion both thrilling and unsettled. Amelia stood by the window, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky. Her heart pounded as Lucas came up behind her, his hands resting lightly on her waist. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and husky. She turned to face him, her resolve wavering for just a moment before she leaned in, her lips capturing his in a kiss that held all the longing she'd kept bottled up. The hours that followed were a blur of passion and whispers, of soft touches and confessions spoken between breaths. Lucas was unlike anything she had ever known, intense, unrelenting, and wholly consuming. When she returned home that night, the smell of his cologne lingered on her skin. Jonathan was asleep on the couch, a book resting on his chest. Amelia stood over him, her heart breaking as she realized how far she had drifted from the man who had once been her whole world. Jonathan wasn't an oblivious man. Noticed the changes in Amelia, the way she seemed distracted during their conversations, the way her phone was always within reach but never open when he glanced her way. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, he decided to confront her. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone careful but probing. Amelia froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant lately," he said, his brow furrowing. "Is there something you're not telling me? Is there something you're not telling me?" She forced a laugh, shaking her head. "No, of course not. I've just been stressed with work. You know how demanding my clients can be." Jonathan nodded slowly, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his, "If something's wrong, you can tell me. We're in this together." Amelia felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took her breath away. She squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "I know, thank you." But as she looked into his trusting eyes, all she could think about was Lucas. The affair with Lucas grew more intense, their stolen moments stretching longer and becoming more reckless. They run dating in the middle of the day, their rendezvous no longer confined to discreet locations. Once, Lucas surprised her by showing up at the art gallery where she worked, pulling her into an empty office for a heated kiss that left her breathless and terrified of being caught. "Lucas, we can keep doing this," she whispered afterward, her cheeks flushed. He cupped her face in his hands, his gaze searching hers. "Amelia, I can't lose you. Tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll walk away." She couldn't. That evening, when she returned home, Jonathan was waiting for her with a question that froze her in her tracks. "Amelia," he began, his voice calm but trembling, "are you having an affair?" Her heart. She opened her mouth to deny it, but the look in his eyes, so full of pain and quiet resignation, rendered her speechless. "I saw your phone," he continued, his voice cracking. "I saw the messages." As she sank into the nearest chair, "Jonathan, Why?" he interrupted, his voice breaking. "Well, I not do something wrong." "No," she whispered, her tears spilling over. "It wasn't you, it was me. I don't know what's wrong with me." Jonathan stood, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "I gave you everything, Amelia. I loved you. I trusted you." "Never stopped loving you," she cried. "Then why?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why wasn't it enough?" She had no answer. Jonathan moved out the next morning, leaving Amelia alone in their once warm home. The silence was deafening, Every corner of the house a painful reminder of what she had destroyed. Lucas tried to fill the void, but the weight of her guilt and the absence of Jonathan created a chasm between them. Their once passionate connection began to feel like an anchor, dragging Amelia further into despair. One rainy evening, as they sat in Lucas' apartment, he turned to her with a question that made her heart sink. "Do you regret it?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know." The rain battered against Lucas's apartment windows, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the chaos in Amelia's mind. She sat on the edge of a chaos in his couch, staring into the untouched cup of tea he had placed before her. Lucas watched her in silence, his usual confidence replaced with something softer, almost hesitant. "I don't know," she repeated, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I regret it. I don't know if I'm happy. I don't know anything anymore." Lucas leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You can't keep living like this, Amelia. You can't keep living like this, Amelia. It's tearing you apart." She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from sleepless nights. "I thought you were the answer," she admitted, her voice cracking. "You made me feel alive, but now I don't even know who I am anymore." His jaw tightened, the tension in the room palpable. "And Jonathan, do you want him back?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Amelia shook her head slowly. "It's not about wanting him back. It's about what I've lost. He was my anchor, Lucas. And now, without him, I feel like I'm adrift." Abruptly, pacing the room. "So what? I was just some escape for you. A way to fill the void." "No," she said, standing to face him. "You are more than that. You are more than that. But what we've done, what I've done, it's destroyed everything. I don't know how to come back from this." He stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then maybe it's time to stop running," he said softly. Jonathan sat alone in his brother's spare room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The room was sparse, the only decoration a small photograph of his niece on the dresser. He stared at the glass, the amber liquid catching the faint glow of the bedside lamp. He had replayed Amelia's confession in his mind 1,000 times, each iteration cutting deeper than the last. He wanted to hate her, to erase the years they had spent together. But every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the woman he had loved, the woman who had once been his everything. His brother, Michael, knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. "Hey, you okay?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Do you think people can change?" Michael frowned, leaning against the door frame. "Depends." Jonathan sighed heavily. "I keep asking myself if this is my fault, if I missed something, if I wasn't enough." "Don't do that to yourself," Michael said firmly. "This isn't on you, John. She made her choices. You can't carry her." "You can't carry her guilt." "But what if I could have stopped it? What if—" Michael cut him off. "Stop. You loved her. You gave her everything. That's more than most people ever get. If she couldn't see that, then that's on her." Jonathan looked down at the glass in his hand, his brother's words ringing hollow in his ears. Amelia stood outside Jonathan's office building, her umbrella shielding her from the light drizzle. She had told herself she was there to return some of his belongings. A forgotten sweater, a book he had left on the nightstand. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the real reason. When Jonathan finally stepped outside, his expression froze at the sight of her. "Amelia," he said, his tone guarded. "Hi," she replied, her voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. He glanced at the bag in her hand. "Some of your things," she said, holding it out to him. "I thought you might want them back." Jonathan hesitated before taking the bag. "You didn't have to come all the way here for this." "I know," she admitted, shifting uncomfortably. I wanted to see you." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Amelia struggled to find the words. "I miss you," she finally said. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't get to say that," he said quietly. "Not after everything." Her heart sank. "Jonathan, I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but—" "You're right," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You don't." She flinched at his words, tears welling in her eyes. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." And for a moment she thought he might soften. But instead he stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't do this, Amelia. Not anymore." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the rain, her heart breaking all over again. Sat in his dimly lit apartment, the remnants of their last fight hanging heavy in the air. Amelia hadn't called in days, and though he tried to tell himself it was for the best, the silence gnawed at him. She had been his escape too, a reprieve from the monotony of his carefully curated life. But now, without her, the walls of his apartment felt suffocating. When his phone buzzed, he snatched it up, his heart leaping at the sight of her name. "We need to talk." Lucas' stomach sank. The words felt final, as though she had already made her decision. When they met later that evening, the tension between them was palpable. Amelia looked tired, her usual spark dulled. "This isn't working," she said softly, her eyes avoiding his. "Amelia," he began, reaching for her, but she stepped back. "I can't do this anymore, Lucas. It's too much. I've lost everything, and I can't keep pretending that we can fix it." He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "I don't regret us," he said quietly. "Neither do I," she admitted, "but it's over." Months passed, and Amelia threw herself into her work, trying to rebuild the life she had shattered. She moved to a smaller apartment in the city, far from the home she had once shared with Jonathan. She heard through mutual friends that Jonathan was dating someone new, a bright, cheerful woman who worked in his firm. The news stung, but Amelia told herself it was for the best. Lucas disappeared from her life entirely. Their chapter closed with painful finality. One quiet evening, as she sat by the window of her apartment, Amelia opened her sketchbook and began to draw. The lines came easily, the chaos in her mind translating into something tangible. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of peace. Amelia remained in the quiet apartment she had moved into after Jonathan left. The place had grown familiar, but it would never feel like home. Every corner seemed to echo with memories, some of Jonathan's laughter, others of Lucas's whispered promises. The two lives she had once juggled were now threads of the past, tangled and frayed. She spent her days working, designing spaces for clients who admired her creativity and paid handsomely for her ideas. Yet, in the quiet moments when she was alone, the weight of her choices pressed on her chest like a stone. One evening, while sorting through old boxes, she found a photo album she hadn't opened in years. Inside were pictures of her and Jonathan during their early years together, smiling, carefree, oblivious to the cracks that would one day appear. Her fingers lingered on one photo in particular. The two of them at a beach, his arms wrapped around her as they laughed at the camera. The memory hit her like a wave, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Not out of regret, but for the person she had been. One rainy afternoon, Amelia sat at her desk with a pen in hand. She had tried many times to write to Jonathan, to find the words that could explain what she had done. Not to win him back. She knew that was impossible. But to offer him the closure she had never been able to give. Dear Jonathan, there are no words that can undo the pain I caused you. I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. But I need you to know that what we had was real to me. You were my safe harbor. You were my safe harbor. Greatest comfort, and the truest love I have ever known. What I did wasn't because of anything you lacked. It was because I lost my way. I lost myself. She stopped, tears smudging the ink. For a moment, she considered finishing the letter. But then she folded the paper and slipped it into a drawer. Some things, she realized, were better left unsaid. Jonathan's life had taken on a new rhythm. After months of counseling and quiet reflection, he found himself opening up to the possibility of happiness again. He had met someone, a kind and vibrant woman named Claire, who brought a warmth to his life that he hadn't realized he was missing. Claire knew about his past, and while she didn't pry, she understood the weight he carried. One evening, as they walked through the park, she stopped him and said, "You don't have to talk about her, but if you ever want to, I'm here." Jonathan looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes grounding him. "Thank you," he said simply, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of peace. Amelia saw Jonathan again by chance, months later, at a gallery opening. He was with Claire, and the two of them moved through the room with an ease that made her heart ache. But it wasn't jealousy. It was a bittersweet kind of happiness. He looked content, and that was all she had ever wanted for him, even if she hadn't known how to give it. She stayed on the other side of the room, not wanting to intrude. But as the night wore on, their eyes met across the gallery. Jonathan's expression was calm, his gaze steady. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even closure. Amelia nodded back, a soft smile playing on her lips. Months turned into years. Amelia continued her work, her designs growing bolder, her reputation flourishing. She learned to live with the weight of her choices, though the memories of Jonathan and Lucas never fully left her. One evening, as she walked through the park near her apartment, she heard the soft strains of a violin. Following the sound, she found a street performer playing a hauntingly beautiful melody. She stood there for a long time, letting the music wash over her. Wasn't closure. She didn't believe in such a thing anymore. But it was acceptance. As she dropped a few bills into the violinist case and turned to leave, she felt lighter somehow. Life wasn't a perfect symphony, but it was hers to lie, flaws and all. Years later, Amelia received a wedding invitation in the mail. It was from Jonathan and Claire. The handwritten note inside read, "Amelia, thank you for everything you taught me. Wishing you peace and happiness. Always, Jonathan." She held the invitation for a long time, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. Finally, she placed it on her desk and turned back to the window. The city stretched out before her, its lights twinkling against the night sky. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. Somewhere, deep within her, The music began to play again.